All right, so you want the truth about demonic possession. We've got a real head-scratcher for you today. We're going deep on Dr. Richard Gallagher, a psychiatrist. And not just any psychiatrist. This guy's Ivy League educated, board certified, teaches at both Columbia University and New York Medical College. You'd think he'd be the last person caught up in the world of exorcisms. Right?
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? You have this prominent figure in the scientific community who has become like a go-to consultant for exorcists across the U.S. Talk about a story that makes you question everything.
It really does. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. Like, we're trying to figure out, is Gallagher really seeing evidence of the demonic? Or is there something else going on?
It's like we're starting a paranormal investigation, right? We have this case, and we've got to examine the evidence and see if it holds up.
Okay, so let's start with Gallagher's background. He didn't just jump into the world of exorcisms overnight. Like, he began his career as pretty hardcore skeptic.
Mm-hmm.
Gallagher viewed those biblical accounts of possession as ancient explanations for what we now understand as mental illness.
Right. That's a common perspective, especially among those in the scientific community. I mean, the human brain is an incredibly complex organ, and we're still just scratching the surface of understanding how it works. So it's tempting to explain these seemingly supernatural phenomena through the lens of neuroscience or psychology.
Right. It's easy to see how someone with Gallagher's training would lean towards those explanations. But then he encountered this patient, Julia, who completely, upended his worldview.
Mm.
Julia was a self-proclaimed satanic priestess who actually sought help from the church.
This is where the line between mental illness and potential spiritual phenomena gets really blurry. Like, Julia's case really highlights how difficult it can be to distinguish between the two. Are we dealing with a psychological condition or something beyond our current understanding?
It's a tough question, and one that Gallagher himself wrestled with. And the details of Julia's case are pretty unsettling, according to Gallagher. She would slip into these trances, speaking in different voices, sometimes deep and guttural, other times high-pitched, and even in Latin. She also exhibited an aversion to holy water, and seemed to know these incredibly personal details about Gallagher's life, things she couldn't have possibly known through normal means.
Yeah, these details definitely send a shiver down your spine. It's no wonder Gallagher was shaken by what he witnessed. It forced him to confront the limits of his scientific knowledge and consider possibilities that he had previously dismissed.
It makes you wonder if even someone as scientifically minded as Gallagher can be convinced. Is there something more to these claims?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But before we jump to conclusions, let's take a step back and examine this idea of demonic possession from a historical and theological perspective. Like, the Catholic Church, for example, has a long and complex history with exorcism.
They even have an official guidebook for it, right?
Yeah.
The Rite of Exorcism, which dates back to 1614.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the rite of exorcism actually cautions exorcists to be cautious and differentiate between genuine demonic possession and signs of mental illness. Like, this demonstrates that the church has been aware of the complexities of the human mind and the potential for misdiagnosis for centuries.
So they're not just blindly attributing everything to demons. They acknowledge that there could be other explanations.
Absolutely. And this is where Pope John Paul II's encyclical Fides Oratio comes in. It delves into the relationship between faith and reason, suggesting they're complementary rather than contradictory. It's a nuanced perspective that seems to align with Gallagher's approach of using scientific observation within a framework of spiritual belief.
It's a fascinating perspective, and one that I think a lot of people can relate to. We live in a world where science and faith are often seen as being at odds with each other, but Gallagher's work suggests that maybe there's a way to bridge that gap.
Perhaps. And this brings us to an intriguing question. Could there be a spiritual dimension to mental health that we're overlooking? Are there experiences that defy traditional psychological or neurological explanations?
It's definitely thought-provoking. Like one of Gallagher's colleagues, Dr. Mark Albanese, even suggested there might be a case for adding a trance and possession disorder diagnosis to the DSM, the manual used to diagnose mental illnesses. He believes that we should be more open to incorporating a patient's spiritual beliefs into their treatment, even if we don't personally share those beliefs.
Now that we've laid the groundwork, let's dive into the heart of the controversy surrounding Gallagher's work. He's received quite a bit of pushback from skeptics who believe there are perfectly rational explanations for everything he's observed.
And leading the charge is Dr. Stephen Novella, a prominent neurologist and vocal critic of Gallagher's claims. Novella argues that much of what Gallagher attributes to demonic possession can be explained by more mundane phenomena.
For example, Novella suggests that Julia's knowledge of Gallagher's personal life could have been obtained through cold reading. It's a technique used by mentalists and illusionists to create the impression that they have special insight into a person's life. By making vague statements and observing the person's reactions, they can gather information and tailor their pronouncements to appear insightful.
So basically, it's a clever way of making educated guesses and picking up on subtle cues. It's not actual supernatural, just good observation and a bit of manipulation.
Exactly. Novella argues that cold reading could explain how Julia seemed to know things about Gallagher that she shouldn't have. He also points to the lack of any concrete filmed evidence of the paranormal activity Gallagher describes during exorcisms. No levitation, no objects flying across the room, just what Novella calls bad play acting by the supposedly possessed individuals.
Novella's stance is that we need extraordinary evidence to support extraordinary claims. And in his view, that evidence is simply lacking in these cases.
However, Gallagher doesn't shy away from these criticisms. He offers his own explanations, suggesting that demons are inherently deceptive and reluctant to be studied or documented. They thrive in doubt, he argues. So it's not surprising that they wouldn't willingly submit to scientific scrutiny.
So it's like a catch-22. If you can't prove they exist, they win. If you can, they lose their power.
Precisely. Gallagher also highlights the ethical considerations involved in filming exorcisms. He argues that the church would never compromise the well-being of someone undergoing an exorcism just to provide footage for skeptics. It's a matter of prioritizing the individual's privacy and dignity above the need for empirical proof.
Now, this is where the debate takes a fascinating turn. Gallagher's critics raise some valid points that we need to consider. Is he being too quick to attribute these unusual events to demonic activity? Or is there something genuinely unexplained happening here?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. To really understand Gallagher's position, we need to delve deeper into his work as a consultant for exorcists. That's where things get really interesting. So we've got the psychiatrist, trained in the scientific method, who's consulting on exorcisms. How does that even work?
Well, it's not like he's running around waving holy water and chanting in Latin. Gallagher's role is much more nuanced than that. He acts as a sort of advisor, helping exorcists determine whether they're dealing with a genuine case of possession or a mental health issue that requires a different approach.
That's a critical distinction. It really highlights the ethical responsibility that Gallagher bears in these situations. Misidentifying a mental health crisis as demonic possession could have devastating consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Gallagher is aware of that responsibility. He emphasizes that he doesn't go looking for these cases. He's sought out by priests who are desperate for his expertise. He's not diagnosing possession on a whim. He's responding to requests for help from religious authorities who are already convinced they're dealing with something beyond the realm of conventional psychology.
Right. That's an important point. It suggests that Gallagher isn't actively seeking out cases to bolster his beliefs. He's entering these situations as a consultant, offering his professional opinion based on his observations and experience.
Yeah, and it's not like he's jumping to conclusions either. Gallagher insists on a thorough evaluation, considering all possible explanations. Before arriving at a diagnosis, he's not just looking for signs of the demonic. He's ruling out any psychological or neurological factors that could be contributing to the individual's distress.
That approach seems to align with the church's own guidelines for discerning possession, right? Like the rite of exorcism explicitly cautions against attributing unusual behavior to demonic influence without first considering other possibilities.
So even within the context of religious belief, there's an understanding that a scientific and methodical approach is necessary. It's not just about blind faith, it's about careful observation and analysis.
Exactly. And this is where Gallagher's background as a psychiatrist comes into play. He's trained to recognize the signs and symptoms of various mental health conditions. And he brings that expertise to his consultations.
It's interesting to contrast Gallagher's, cautious approach with that of other psychiatrists who've dabbled in exorcism. Dr. M. Scott Peck, for example, author of the best-selling book The Road Less Traveled, actually conducted exorcisms himself.
Peck's experiences were quite controversial, and Gallagher believes that's a risky path for a psychiatrist to take. He argues that there's a clear distinction between diagnosing potential possession and performing the ritual of exorcism itself. That's a realm best left to religious authorities.
So Gallagher sees himself as more of a guide, helping navigate the complex intersection of mental health and spiritual belief.
Precisely. And that raises a broader question. Could there be a place for this kind of integrated approach in mainstream mental health care? Could incorporating spiritual beliefs into treatment, even for those who don't subscribe to a particular religion, be beneficial?
It's a thought-provoking question. We tend to compartmentalize mental health and spirituality. But for many people, those aspects of their lives are deeply intertwined.
And dismissing or ignoring those beliefs could be detrimental to the individual's well-being. Dr. Albanese, who we mentioned earlier, argues that we need to be more open to exploring the potential therapeutic value of incorporating spirituality into treatment.
Right. It's not about imposing any particular belief system, but rather about acknowledging and respecting the role that spirituality plays in the lives of many individuals.
Exactly. It's about meeting people where they are and providing care that addresses the whole person, mind, body, and spirit.
Now let's circle back to Julia, the satanic priestess who first led Gallagher down this path. What ultimately became of her?
Unfortunately, her story doesn't have a clear-cut ending. Gallagher and a team of exorcists worked with her for a while, but she eventually decided to stop the sessions. It seems she was ambivalent about being free from the demonic influence, like she enjoyed some of the abilities she displayed during her trances.
It's almost as if she was caught between two worlds, drawn to both the darkness and the light.
Gallagher describes it as playing both sides. He emphasizes that exorcism isn't like a magic bullet. It requires the individual's active participation and a genuine desire to be free from the perceived demonic influence.
Right. Even if you believe in the possibility of possession, it stands to reason that the individual has to be willing to let go of that influence for the exorcism to be effective.
Exactly. It's not something that can be forced on someone. It requires their agency and cooperation.
And tragically, Julia's story took a turn for the worse. About a year after she stopped the exorcisms, she contacted Gallagher to tell him she was dying of cancer.
Gallagher offered to help her again, but her response was hesitant. It seemed she was still struggling with her beliefs, unsure about what path to take.
And sadly, he never heard from her again. It leaves us with this lingering sense of unanswered questions. What ultimately became of her? Did she find peace in her final days? We simply don't know.
It's a reminder that even in the face of profound spiritual or existential crisis, the answers aren't always clear, and sometimes the journey is more about the questions we ask than the answers we find.
That's a profound thought, and it brings us back to the core of this whole discussion. What are we to make of Gallagher's experiences? Is he truly seeing evidence of the demonic? Or is there something else going on?
It's a question that each listener will have to grapple with on their own. There's no definitive proof to sway one way or the other.
I think that's one of the most intriguing things about this deep dive. It challenges our assumptions about the world and forces us to confront the possibility that there might be more to reality than meets the eye.
Right. It's about acknowledging the limits of our understanding and being open to the idea that there are mysteries we may never fully comprehend.
And maybe that's okay. Maybe a little mystery is what keeps life interesting.
Absolutely. It's the unknown that drives our curiosity and compels us to explore. And even if we don't find all the answers, the journey of discovery can be incredibly rewarding.
So putting aside the debate about demonic possession for a moment, let's consider the broader implications of Gallagher's work. What does this tell us about the intersection of science and faith in our modern world?
Well, on the one hand, we have science, which emphasizes empirical evidence and rational explanation. On the other hand, we have faith, which often deals with matters that are beyond the reach of scientific inquiry. And for many people, those two realms aren't mutually exclusive. They find ways to reconcile their belief in a higher power with their acceptance of scientific principles.
It's like walking a tightrope between these two seemingly opposing forces. Like, how do you hold on to the rigor of scientific methodology while still allowing space for the mysteries of faith?
Yeah, it's like he's creating a new language, one that can encompass both the objective and the subjective, the empirical and the spiritual.
And in doing so, he's raising some important questions about the limits of science and the nature of belief. Is it possible that our current scientific framework is simply inadequate to explain certain phenomena? Are there aspects of reality that lie beyond the reach of empirical investigation?
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? We like to think that science can explain everything. But what if there are things that defy our current methods of observation and analysis? What if there are realms of existence that we simply haven't developed the tools to understand yet?
It's certainly possible. I mean, throughout history, there have been countless examples of things that were once considered supernatural or inexplicable that were later explained by science. But that doesn't mean that everything can or will be explained. There may be some things that remain inherently mysterious, forever beyond the grasp of our rational minds.
And maybe that's not a bad thing. Like a little mystery can be a good thing. It keeps us curious, it keeps us exploring, it keeps us open to the possibility that there's more to life than we currently understand.
Absolutely. It's that sense of wonder and awe that drives us to seek knowledge and understanding. And even if we never find all the answers, the journey itself can be incredibly enriching.
So where does that leave us with Gallagher's work? We've explored the evidence, we've considered the arguments for and against his claims, and we've delved into the broader implications of his approach. What's the takeaway for our listener? What can they glean from this deep dive?
Well, I think the most important thing is to approach this topic with an open mind and a healthy dose of skepticism. It's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism of demonic possession, but it's crucial to remember that we're dealing with complex issues that don't lend themselves to easy answers.
It's not about blindly believing everything you hear or dismissing it outright. It's about carefully weighing the evidence, considering different perspectives, and forming your own conclusions.
Exactly. And even if you ultimately disagree with Gallagher's conclusions, his work can still serve as a valuable starting point for exploring some fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the limits of human understanding, and the role of faith in our life.
It challenges us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to be open to the possibility that there might be more to the world than meets the eye.
And that, I think, is the ultimate value of this deep dive. It's not about providing definitive answers, but rather about sparking curiosity and encouraging deeper reflection.
So to wrap things up, what would you say is the one thing you want our listener to walk away with after listening to this deep dive?
I would say it's this. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Don't be afraid to explore the unknown, because it's in those moments of curiosity and exploration that we truly learn and grow.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. If even a highly respected psychiatrist like Dr. Gallagher can be convinced of the reality of demonic possession, shouldn't we at least be open to the possibility? Food for thought, right?
Indeed. And perhaps that's the most intriguing aspect of this whole discussion. It leaves us with more questions than answers, which in many ways is the most exciting outcome of all.
You've been listening to The Deep Dive, where we take complex topics and break them down into bite-sized pieces of knowledge. We hope this deep dive has challenged your assumptions, sparked your curiosity, and left you with some lingering questions to ponder. Until next time, keep diving deep.